Just want to tell y'all how excited I am and how excited all of us on the staff are to open 3 really great exhibitions today. Of course, y'all are here today to hear about TGP, but as you go through the galleries, you'll see, as you walked in here, you saw another exhibition that we're opening today called Extension in our Mallory and Wurzburger galleries. That's actually guest curated by Corky Sinks. She's on the staff here. She's our graphic designer, but she is an artist herself and helped curate and organize this exhibition. We're very excited about that. And we also have a small exhibition in our Wilmot Gallery about, it's called From the Marne to the Rhine, Jean-Louis Forain in World War I. So you all know, you long-term Dixonians know, we have a great history with promoting the work of Jean-Louis Forain, and in 2016 we received a gift of 38 of his Forain's lithographs from World War I, and we've assembled those with a couple other things into an exhibition that I hope y'all will come back again to experience. And mark your calendars at the end of this month, so kind of fuzzy on the date, but the last Sunday of October, Alice Valdez Forain, who is the great-great-great-granddaughter of Jean-Louis Forain, served as the guest curator of that project, and she'll be here giving tours the last Sunday of October and the last Tuesday of October. So mark your calendars and come and see that. So on to TGP. We've actually had this exhibition on our calendar here for quite some time. Bill Island, who I hope you heard speak briefly at the opening on Thursday evening, presented it to Kevin, and Kevin came down and showed it to me, and we both knew this show was going to be a great fit for the Dixon and a great project for us to put in front of all of you. But right away, when we showed the work to the other department heads here at the Dixon, everybody kind of latched onto it and got super excited about it. So, of course, education did, curatorial did, even, departments like accounting and the gardens and development, everybody has, and marketing has really rallied around this exhibition, and we're excited for what this show can do for us this fall. So I hope y'all will enjoy it, and I want to thank all of the staff at the Dixon for their role in bringing this exhibition to life, and I want to thank all of our sponsors for making it possible. So thanks to everyone. So this lecture today is only the beginning of our education programming surrounding the TGP exhibition. I hope y'all will go into in the Phillips Gallery at the end of the show. Our education department has put together an interactive gallery called El Taller, the workshop, and we'll be having education events take place in that space and throughout the property throughout the run of the show. There's actually a calendar in the Taller, in the workshop, that lets you know all the different events that will be taking place there, including artist demonstrations. We'll be having artists come to the Dixon, come into that gallery, and do printmaking demonstrations throughout the run of the show, and we're super excited about that. But today I want to welcome Deborah Caplow and tell you a little bit about her before she gets going. She gave our docent training, she gave a tour to our docents and the staff on Friday, and it really helped bring this beautiful work to life. So I'm excited to hear what Deborah has to say today. So just a little bit about Deborah. Dr. Deborah Caplow is an art historian and curator with a specialty in Mexican art and culture. She is a professor of art history at the University of Washington, Bothell campus, and is the author of the only full-length book in English about the Mexican printmaker Leopoldo Mendes, one of the most important members of the Taller de Gráfica Popular. She has also written numerous articles about Mexican art of the 20th century, including 3 essays in the catalog El Taller de Gráfica Popular, Vida y Arte, which accompanies this exhibition, and it's that beautiful big orange book that is for sale in the shop, and I really recommend it. I mean, it is the most complete work in English on TGP, and I think you'll find it illustrates everything that's in the show and then so much more. So if you're interested in the subject, definitely check it out. Deborah's research interests include Mexican art of all eras and mediums, graffiti and urban art, women artists, art and politics, and the history of photography. She is currently researching contemporary printmaking in Oaxaca, Mexico, and has organized a major exhibition of prints by Oaxacan artists that will open in Oaxaca on November 10th of this year in the Centro de las Artes de San Agustin. So you're busy, Deborah. So thank you so much for making the time to come to Memphis, and I hope y'all will join me in welcoming Deborah. I turn it off? Oh, you have that. Okay.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for coming, and thanks very much to the museum for having me.
There we go.
I'd especially like to thank Kevin, Julie, Margarita, Lindley, and Elise, who've been very welcoming and obviously have put a lot of passion and love and care into this exhibition. It's been really a delight to be here. I think I saw the show when it was in Athens, Georgia, and it's so wonderful to see it again and to spend some time with the images again. I've been interested in the Taller de Gráfica Popular for a long, long time. I did my research in the 90s about Leopoldo Mendes, and I've spent a year in Mexico interviewing some of the very elderly artists who were the last remaining live members of the TGP. And at that time, it was a very little-known group, and Mendes was a very little-known artist. He's become much more famous and much more respected, I think, partly because of the efforts of a number of scholars. There have been numerous exhibitions of Mendes and the TGP, and so it's it's a growing field of study and interest. I wanted to start out by providing a kind of a historical context for the artists of the TGP, going back to the 20s. In the 1920s, there was a Mexican artistic renaissance, often called the Mexican mural renaissance, because it centered on muralism, and there were three great muralists, Diego Rivera, who is the most famous of them, Jose Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. And they were all members of the Communist Party. Orozco wasn't, but most of the muralists and painters were members of the Communist Party, and the government was funding the mural movement, and they were making murals on public buildings, and they attracted the attention of artists, writers, and other creative people from all over the world who came to Mexico because it was the place to do art and make music and be a literary person. And the muralists themselves formed a union because the idea of art that was very persistent to the time of the TGP was that the artist was a worker, a cultural worker, and that they should be paid by the day, and that they really should be working for the benefit of the people and not for riches and fame. So this is an image here of the headquarters of the Communist Party in Mexico City from the middle of the 1920s. And what's significant here is that you can see right here the masthead of the El Machete, which was the newspaper of the Muralists Union for a short while, and then it became the official newspaper of the Communist Party. After the Muralist Union, which only lasted for about a year and a half, after they dissolved, it became the communist newspaper. But the masthead has a print on it, basically. It's a print by Javier Guerrero, who was one of the muralists and printmakers at this time. So the precedent was established for using print for political purposes right after the revolution. The Mexican Revolution was over in 1920. The muralists formed their union in 1924. And then the people of Mexico started to think of art as having a political purpose. Another image I have here is from the 1930s, and this is a puppet show in Mexico City. And didactic puppetry became an art form that was done by the artists and with political intent, and it was to capture the population. There was this concept of the masses of people, the urban proletariat, the campesinos, who were the farmers in the countryside, and that they were important to the construction of a new and progressive Mexico. Artists like Mendes and other people who were associated with him made puppets. They worked within the Department of Education to make puppet theaters in the schools, and they also traveled them around to neighborhoods. So here's a puppet show, and you can see that it has a very enthusiastic crowd looking at the puppets, and this is also in Mexico City. All of the work of the TGP was centered in Mexico City. They had, in the very historic center of Mexico City is where they had the workshop, and it moved to 3 locations, but all in the center of Mexico City. The TGP based its work in a number of art forms of the past. They were extremely inspired by the work of Jose Guadalupe Posada, and there are a few posadas in the show, really nice ones. And this is probably the most well-known of all the posadas, Calavera Catrina, from around 1900. And he popularized the use of the skeleton and skull, and that format is called the calavera. And here you see a rich lady who is a skeleton and has a tremendous amount of humor, which is something that the TGP appreciated. And the muralists themselves took on the work of Posada as a truly Mexican work. They thought of it as a very Mexican form, and they were looking toward all things Mexican in the 1920s. So they emulated some of the calaveras and included them in their murals. Here's another work by Posada, also very humorous. This is the Calavera de Don Quixote, and it shows Don Quixote on a horse, and using his extremely animated technique of composition and very animated graphic linear design to show the sort of absurdity of Don Quixote's quest, with the little skeletons all falling apart and grinning wildly as they fly through the air. Another work by Posada is this, which is in the exhibition, and it's called Calavera Revolucionaria, and represents a female soldier in one of the revolutionary armies. The Revolution of Mexico lasted from 1910 to 1920, and it was a very complex revolution because really it was a revolution for just a short while, and then it became a civil war with 3 factions, and then it ended around 1920 with sporadic uprisings during the 20s. But after 1920, Mexico ended up having a democratically elected government. The early murals incorporated the use of Posada, and here you can see calaveras in a mural of Diego Rivera. It's in the Ministry of Education building in Mexico City, and it has the 3 sectors of Mexican society that people were theorizing about at this time. They were looking back at the revolution and incorporating some of the imagery of the revolution into the murals of the 20s. And in fact, the conquest of Mexico, which was an incredibly interesting and complex story, and the Mexican Revolution became the primary material for art at this time in Mexico. This is looking at the revolution from the point of view of the mid-1920s, so looking back just a few years, and the puppets, which are sort of jointed puppet-like images, which are also calaveras, represent the farmer of Mexico, the campesino, the soldier of the revolution, and the urban worker. And they called this the Revolutionary Trinity, and it was an image that came up over and over in the work of the muralists and other artists, as we will see. It's also showing the interest in, again, the masses, the crowds, the population of Mexico, including, in this case, a wide variety of people of all different shades of color and different social class, and a self-portrait of Rivera right here in the middle. And he even included a kind of satirical portrait of American tourists in this crowd of Day of the Dead revelers. Then Rivera was looking back at the revolution in many different ways, and this is his mural of Emiliano Zapata, the great hero of the Mexican Revolution, who became sort of the symbolic hero of the revolution. And in this mural, he's not only referring to the revolution itself, but also to the conquest, because the conquest of Mexico with the conquistadors had happened between 1519 and 1520, long before this. But here Zapata is stepping on a dead conquistador, and the implication is that the revolution is finishing the process of independence. So the other thing that happened is that printmaking became very, very important in the 20s. And here's a print from the painting that Rivera did. He did lithographs of many of his mural paintings. And Orozco did prints, and Siqueiros did prints. They all did, the major muralists all did prints. And a young man named Jean Charlot came to Mexico with the technique of printmaking of woodcuts, and he taught younger artists who were the sort of half generation below the three muralists and had gone to the School of Fine Arts at the Academy of San Carlos. He taught them woodblock printing, and it became a very popular format. It was considered ideal for communicating political ideals and ideas, even in the 1920s. Another great source of inspiration for the artists of the Taller de Gráfica Popular were the European and American and other printmakers who were politically motivated. They were extremely interested in the work of Goya, and of course that comes through the connection with Spain also. And Goya's Disasters of War, for example, the series of prints that he made after the Peninsular Wars, he made them between 1810 and 1820, are very rich in source material for the Taller de Gráfica Popular. And they were very admiring of Daumier, whose work was also highly political. And one of the things that these artists had in common, Goya, Daumier, and the next artist I'll show you, is the way in which their work is a denunciation of oppression and violence against the helpless. And this is a theme that we'll see in the TGP over and over again. This is Daumier's print from the 1830s about the murder of a family during the Revolution of 1830 in Paris, when the police went into apartment buildings and killed people randomly. And you can see that it's very direct in its political message, and of course has applications which continue into the present day. Then the third artist of Europe who made a very huge impression on artists of the TGP is Katie Kollwitz. And her work is anti-war, and anti-poverty, anti-injustice, and she was very active in the 1920s. She also worked from 1900 to 1945, but her work was extremely popular in the 1920s as there was a kind of great interest in pacifism in Europe after the First World War. And these were the heroes of the TGP, and Posada and these great European printmakers and the muralists. Those were their base. Another printmaker, I guess you could say, not really printmaking exactly, but he did photo collage, not really printmaking, graphic in a way, is the German printmaker John Hartfield. And we'll see in a while some direct emulations of Hartfield's collage style in print form. Here, John Hartfield worked in the late 20s and in the early 30s against fascism, and he had to move from Germany because of his political work. And this one on the left says, as in the Middle Age, so in the Third Reich. And you can see the obvious reference to the wheel, the torture wheel, and the swastika. And the one on the right is blood and steel. So we'll see some commonalities later on that have to do with Hartfield. Mendes, I'll be focusing quite a bit on Mendes in this talk since he's my study really. And this is a picture of Mendes from the 1930s. And it's characteristic of him and his companions that they thought of themselves as obreros, or workers. And he was known to always wear denim overalls. And of course it's very practical when you're doing printmaking, which is a very dirty art form, to wear denim overalls, but it also was a way of claiming some kinship with the working class, which he actually came from a working class background, as did many of them. This is a print by Mendes when he was working in a group called the Stridentists. It was the Stridentist movement. And he was developing a kind of revolutionary, iconic language, you could say, that was paralleling other artists of the time. So here you see a hammer and sickle. It's the illustration of a book about the revolution. So it's an elusive symbol of the revolution. The author is Praxedis Guerrero Tablada. And it's called Un Fragmento de la Revolución. And it was published in Veracruz. You can see all of this in this beautiful woodblock, very early printmaking by Mendes. It has its parallels in two other art forms that were also happening at the same time, one of which was the photography of the well-known photographer Tina Modotti. Modotti was an Italian immigrant to the US who moved to Mexico in 1924 with her companion Edward Weston and stayed until she was deported in 1929 because of political activities. And she made this extraordinary photograph that's also connected to the Mexican Revolution and also connected to this concept of the Revolutionary Trinity. The idea of the corn, the guitar, and the ammunition belt is the unity of these three sectors of the campesino. I think of the guitar as the cultural worker, the corn is the farmer, and the ammunition belt is obviously the soldier. But it's a symbol of the revolution and of the continuing idea of revolution in Mexican politics and Mexican thought at this point. Oops, sorry. And this is another mural by Diego Rivera, which also has the same kind of iconic power. So this is part of a mural at the National Agricultural School in a town called Chapingo outside of Mexico City. So the three of them were doing sort of iconic work at the same time in the same central part of Mexico with the same purposes of expressing the idea of the importance of the revolution and the idea of the continuing revolution. All of them thought that the revolution should be continued and that it hadn't met its promises, but that it should and could with enough efforts by dedicated activists and artists. Here's another example of a mural. This is by Pablo O'Higgins, and he was another American, who moved to Mexico and he became a Mexican citizen. He became Mendes's lifelong best friend, companion, artistic partner about 1929, and they, along with another artist named Luis Arenal, founded the Taller de Gráfica Popular. This is a mural that was part of an effort by a group of people from the League of Revolutionary Artists and Writers. That was a group Mendes belonged to. He was also a founder of that group, as he was a founder of the TGP. And Mendes started to use calaveras around 1934. And this is a work that's also in the show, in the TGP show out here. And it was the first cover, the illustration of the first cover of the League of Revolutionary Artists and Writers tabloid paper called Frente a Frente. And it's a satire of Diego Rivera and the Mexican government. You can see Diego Rivera on the left there, and it's the occasion of the inauguration of the Opera House in the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City. And it's a denunciation of Rivera as a government collaborator, basically, at a time when the TGP and their companions were opposed to, when the League of Revolutionary Artists and Writers were opposed to the government, which changed in the following year when a new president came to power, whose name was Lázaro Cárdenas. This is called the Calaveras del Mausoleo Nacional. He's calling it the National Mausoleum instead of the National Palace of Fine Arts. And it was the Opera House, so it was an elitist kind of thing, and he was basically accusing Rivera of elitism and the government of fascism. You can see on the back of Riva Palacios seat a swastika, the first time that, as far as I know, that Mendes used a swastika in one of his works, which he did many times afterwards. And on the back of Rivera's is a dollar sign, which is actually a peso sign, which shows Mendes' opinion that Rivera was a sellout, basically. And this was a very complicated art statement that positioned Mendes as in opposition to Rivera, who was in opposition to many of the artists for his political views, his support for Trotsky at this time. So here's another work by Mendes from Lear, as they called that group. And here you can see direct use of Posada's imagery, the simplicity of it, the little figures that you see up here and here. But it's very topical, as was so much of this work, and it represents the killing of unarmed demonstrators by members of a fascist group called the ARM, or Camisas Doradas. He was also interested in the plight of teachers. He himself was part of the cultural missions that went out from the central government in the 1930s to teach, 20s and 30s, to teach art to school children and adults in rural communities, along with other technical and manual skills. And this is an image that is about the killing of teachers by radical right-wing Catholics who thought the teachers were teaching communism and sex education and perverting the young. And during a rebellion called the Cristero Rebellion, they killed 150 teachers in Mexico, over 150. And this is a series, but it's also in the show by Mendes, of the killing of teachers. So here you see some evidence of surrealism that creeps into Mendes's work. And then this is a kind of a reference to Goya, oddly enough. This is a killing of a school teacher by hanging, and there's a sign around his neck denouncing him from his murderers. And here's the direct reference back to Goya from The Disasters of War. And you can see the connection is quite strong here. The other artists were working with Mendes at this time in this group, and they also formed the nucleus of the TGP. This is Pablo O'Higgins, and he was the person who did that other mural I showed you. And this is about the Spanish Civil War. They were starting to be interested in international politics around 1935 or so. And in 1936, when the Spanish Civil War broke out, they were extremely interested in that. And this is a condemnation of pro-Franco, fascist-leaning Spanish people in Mexico who were monopolizing, and still do to this day, actually have something of a monopoly on the grocery industry or the grocery business in Mexico. And this is about price controls of basic necessities, like it says corn, beans, etc. And they're raising the prices on the backs of the poor, literally as vultures. He's showing them as vultures. Mendes did this print in 1937 with a growing awareness of the disaster that was happening in Europe. And it's called the Menace of Fascism, and it's also in the exhibition. It's about the idea that fascism, here's Hitler and Mussolini, they were very, very prescient, this group of artists. And Hitler and Mussolini, as a kind of a double-headed monster, are looming over a small hut of a Mexican campesino family. So the idea is that the coming World War is going to affect everybody in the entire world and not just people in Europe. So they started, the TGP was forming around this time, 1937, and they started to shift their focus from domestic fascism, which you see here in this work, where these are local fascists who were, pro-Hitler, but it was kind of early 1935, to a very international focus with this. And the way that they were using these images, a lot of the time was on posters, and the posters were disseminated by being glued onto the city with wheat paste. And they had special people who would go and plaster the walls of the center of Mexico with their posters. And here you can see someone doing that, putting posters on the wall. And here you can see a very self-referential work by Mendes that's a promotion for the TGP. We're in that phase. And this is a member of the urban working class looking at a poster on the wall. And if you look at the photograph, it's very similar, the same sort of positioning of this poster. There's actually another photograph in existence that's even more closely tied to this image. And then they were also referring to that in this TGP image that shows the working class looking at the image on the wall, and the members of the TGP working collectively to produce the work that then goes on the wall. They produced a huge amount of anti-fascist, anti-Nazi imagery during this time, starting around 1937, 1938. There was a series of 20 lectures in Mexico City about fascism and Nazism. And Mexico was receiving an enormous influx of refugees. They had an open-door policy for refugees, and it's estimated between 20 and 25,000 Spanish refugees came at the end of the Spanish Civil War. And many, many Mexican, European communists and socialists came to Mexico because the United States wouldn't let them in, and if they stayed where they were, they would be killed and imprisoned and killed. So they were getting a lot of first-hand information, and they were very active in promoting the idea that this was a great danger to the world. So each one of these was a separate topic. Here's Nazi propaganda and spying. And this one is about the economy of totalitarianism. This is a work by one of the numerous guest artists who came to the TGP. They invited people from the United States to come for summer school classes in printmaking. And they also were becoming famous enough throughout the United States and Europe that people came just to see them and to participate. And they would have guest artists who worked with them for anywhere from a month to a year or longer. And then a few people actually came from other countries and stayed. Several Americans, including Elizabeth Catlett, Marianne Yampolsky, and Pablo Higgins, and Charles White for a briefer time. And then there was a person from Ecuador named Galo Galecio, and so they had a very international focus. And this was one by a guest artist named Robert Mallory. And then here's one by Alfredo Salce, and this is about the woman in Nazi society. And you can see here that the woman is just basically a baby producer for the children who will go off to be cannon fodder. This one is about fascism in Latin America, and this one is about German fascism. And this one is interesting because it links back to the muralists. This is by Arenal and a companion of his named Antonio Pujol, and they were at that time working with Siqueiros on a remarkable mural, which is still in existence in the Mexico City headquarters of the Electrical Worker Union. And this is a really interesting project. It was Siqueiros was the most radical politically of all the muralists, and he was also the most experimental technically, although he, in the middle of the making of this mural, it has his name on it, but really it was a team of workers, and he had to leave in 1940 very quickly because he was involved with an attempted assassination of Trotsky. And this involved the TGP in a very dramatic way because he was working with Luis Arenal to assassinate Trotsky, who was later, about 3 months later, actually assassinated in Mexico, another fascinating story. But he didn't succeed in the assassination attempt, but Arenal was a member of the TGP and he was part of the team. And they used the headquarters of the TGP, they used the actual workshop to change into paramilitary guise and disguises. They borrowed Diego Rivera's van and they went and machine gunned Trotsky's house. So in the morning, the police came to the TGP and arrested Mendes and the printer of the TGP, who was named Jose Sanchez, and they spent some weeks in jail. And Mendes was extremely angry about this. But meanwhile, this mural wasn't finished yet, and the person who supervised the continuing work was named Josep Renau, who was a Spanish collage artist. And this is a remarkable three-dimensional mural. This, if you can see it, it's actually on 3 walls and a ceiling, and the walls curve up toward us. It's in a stairwell. And it's about the international situation in 1939, 1940, when the war was had come to some places and was engulfing the whole world. But there's a direct relationship with this because the imagery here is almost exactly the same. This is a TGP production, but here you see the same burning buildings, the same kind of bird-headed sort of monster. And it's the direct relationship between what they were doing in this mural and what they were doing in the workshop of the TGP. And here's a work by O'Higgins that's the man in Nazi society, and that relates back to the Hartfield that I was talking about. In this Hartfield and the one that has the person crucified on the swastika. One of the most important things, in my opinion, about the work of the TGP is the book that they did called the Libro Negro del Terror Nazi en Europa. And this book was an effort with the German community in exile in Mexico City. They were linked to that community by the director of the TGP, whom they hired after he moved to Mexico from Germany. He was the former director of the Bauhaus, and his name was Hannes Meyer. And he had a very strong connection with the German exile community, which then developed a very strong connection with the TGP. So they contributed over 50 prints to this book, and it was illustrated with prints and photographs, horrific photographs actually, And they were essays from all the countries of Europe that had been invaded by the Nazis. This was the only book of its type. It was a remarkable documentation by people who had been there recently or were in touch with people who had been there recently. And it was only published in Spanish at this point, and it was never widely disseminated. The information didn't really get out, but it was an incredible effort to publicize what was really going on, and evidence that the Holocaust and other kinds of atrocities were known if you knew where to look for them. The myth is that we didn't know until after the war, but actually the information was there. It was hard to find sometimes, but it really was available. Mendes was learning because there were communiques between Europe and Mexico, and they were published in a newspaper, a journal of the Workers' University that he read regularly. The frontispiece is by Franz Mazarel and has a skeleton that was not a calavera, it's a Mazarel sort of skeleton. He was a very well-known Belgian printmaker and draftsman. There was another work by William Gropper, an American printmaker. And then Mendes produced a number of works that were for this and published in other places. This is about the heroic people of Yugoslavia. And this is one of the publications, other than the Black Book, that it appears in, which is the newsletter of the German community in exile. It's called Free Germany. And I wanted to go back to this. Later I'll come back to this one. And then within the book there are some really horrific images, but they're very important images. This is about the Gestapo, and it shows a kind of awareness of what really was going on in the Gestapo torture chambers, including what I call the banality of evil, where the Gestapo seemed like it's all in a day's work. And then this is another one by Robert Mallory about the Nazi regime. And this is a work by Pablo Higgins about Hitler and the Jews. It accompanied an essay called Hitler and the Jews. And then this is about the eviction of peoples all over Europe by the Nazis. And then this is one of the three most important works by Mendes that, in my opinion, are his sort of master prints. This is called Deportation to Death. And this is also in the Black Book. You can see this here. Here, it accompanied an article called The Extermination of the Jews. And probably one of the first and only writings that was done. This was 1943, right in the middle of the war. And people didn't know about it, but it was a testimony. People were trying to get the information out, but it was being blocked in various ways. One of the things that happened was that the British and the Americans decided to deal with what they called the Jewish question after the war. They made it a policy decision that they weren't going to deal with it during the war, but after the war, which was responsible for many millions more deaths. But here we have, the news is here in this brief article, and it has statistics. It talks about Auschwitz. It's very, very penetrating in terms of its historical significance. And the work itself is extremely powerful. It shows a boxcar with a group of Jewish people, and on the side over here are some soldiers loading some other people into another boxcar. At the end is a plume of smoke from the train engine, but it obviously would remind anybody of the smoke from the crematoria. And Mendes did a very interesting thing, which he introduced some very religious kinds of imagery here. For example, these people all look very biblical, but they also look like rural Mexicans. And the woman here is cradling an old man in her hand, and it's a very, sort of like a pietà, a very religious image, and it's taken place by lantern light. A very powerful image, and maybe the first image of the Holocaust from a person who didn't actually endure the concentration camps. I haven't found any image that's earlier than this one. This is the way the book looks, basically. It's full of illustrations and articles, really interesting articles to this day. And then a lot of the work was published separately as well in corrido format in the broadsheets that you see in the show. And this is the Battle of Stalingrad, and the hero of the Battle of Stalingrad was a general named General Timoshenko, whom Mendes depicted a couple of times. Then sort of in between all of this work on the war, they were also doing other interesting things that were a little bit less urgent, I think, in some ways. And one of the most skilled artists of the TGP, who wasn't there very long, he was there from 1937 to 1941, is Jose Chavez Morado. And he was very funny as an artist. He made extremely biting satire. This is called The Clergy and the Press. And here is the clergy, obviously, sort of like almost like a Disney cartoon or something. And here are the people of the press, who are all depicted as animals. It's very incisive and very funny and very interesting visually. Another work by Chavez Morado is called Dance of Death, which is a little more general, but sort of refers to what's going on in 1939 in a more general way, more elusive and more metaphorical, and also refers to Mexican folk dancing, Mexican traditional dances. And then he did this wonderful image of people in 1938 donating their possessions to the Mexican government on the occasion of the expropriation of the oil industry in Mexico. The progressive president of Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, who came in 1934 when the TGP members who were still in the other group, the older group, were very anti-government. And then they switched their allegiance to the government because Lázaro Cárdenas was so progressive. And he basically took away the oil fields from the oil companies and appealed to the people of Mexico to donate their money to pay for the costs of doing that. So here they are in this wonderful, shadowy and beautiful print by Chavez Morado. She's taking off her earrings. These people are, this little boy is emptying out his piggy bank. And there are photographs of this process where people are lined up to give their money to the government, to give their possessions, their chickens, their pigs, their jewelry, their clothing, anything they could think of that had any value. They donated to the government for the cost of this thing that was part of the national pride of Mexico, to restore the natural resources to the Mexican people. The Constitution of 1917 actually has an article in it which stipulates that the wealth of Mexico, underground wealth, belongs to the Mexican government. So it's supposed to have been that way all along, but it wasn't until then. Unfortunately, in the last 15 years, the Mexican government has been trying to sell off the petroleum industry and privatizing it. So things are going backwards a bit in that way. Another work by Pablo Higgins is this also very metaphorical and absolutely stunning image called Man of the 20th Century from 1940. And his bricklayer and his son from around the same time. And then Mendes did a book that's in the exhibit. It's not open, but I think you'll be seeing some on an iPad eventually. And this was a book of, it was like a folk tale, and it was written by a friend of his, and it had songs and story in Spanish and Mayan. So it had actual musical notes, and it had Mayan language, and it had Spanish, and it had a lot of pre-Columbian imagery, like this one, which is a calavera, but it looks more like a pre-Columbian calavera rather than a Posada calavera. And here's some direct pre-Columbian imagery. Here's some Mayan imagery of deities, and here is a kind of a wild, back to Posada calavera. And then one of the other great images by Mendes, what I think of as his three masterprints, is this self-portrait of 1945. And the self-portrait of 1945 is a summation of his life in a way. He drew, this is probably the last time that he had a swastika in any of his works. And it's an extraordinarily complicated image. Here's an eagle crucified on a cross that's also a swastika. And the eagle is has the tail of a serpent wound around its feet, and the serpent is disgorging a procession that goes toward Mexico City in the distance. And Mendes is here lying on what seems to be a portfolio of Posada prints. So we have tremendous amount of allusion to Mexican history, and in fact it's sort of a summary of Mexican history from pre-Columbian times to the present. What he did here was used the Mexican national symbol, and the Mexican national symbol is an eagle on a cactus with a snake in its mouth, or a snake in its talons. And he deconstructed that symbol and turned it around so that the eagle is actually bound rather than victorious. And he also was referring to a great 19th century landscape painter, Jose Maria Velasco, who did numerous depictions of Mexico City at a time when Mexico City was very, very small and extraordinarily beautiful. This is the Valley of Mexico, which is now completely filled in with houses and buildings and highways. But this is Mexico City in the background here. And he had a formula of usually a bluff like this in the foreground and a causeway that went back to the city. And here he also included a Mexican national symbol because there's the cactus and there's an eagle. And this is the base of the painting. This is a discovery that I made when I was looking at this. I think I was the first person to point this out. Here's the bluff that you see, and here's the causeway, and here's Mexico City in the background. So he's talking about Velasco in this painting. He's also referring to pre-Columbian art with the snake, and that was a work that he did in the book. This is an image from the book, The Incidentes Melódicos del Mundo Irracional, the book I was just showing you, which is melodic incidents of an irrational world. So going back here, we're also seeing Mendes in a position of contemplation, like the print by Dürer that's called Melancholia, where the personage is sitting with his arm up and his hand on his chin, which is the typical iconographic representation of the idea of melancholy. And he's wondering, he has put his name here. This was produced for a solo exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1945. He put Mendes 1945. The exhibition was opened in January of 1945, and the war's conclusion was sort of known. People knew that the Allies were going to win, and they knew the war would be over. And I see this as a work about the committed artist, the political artist who has put all of his energy into anti-fascist, anti-Nazi work, and now it's going to be something else, and he doesn't know what it's going to be. It's kind of like, what next? And it's like an existential crisis that happened to millions of people at the end of the Second World War, and he's expressing that here. And then he's on a base of Posada, who was his inspiration for his very first calaveras. This is a work from the Incidentes Melódicos, and I wanted to show you how closely related that is to pre-Columbian art. This is a pre-Columbian codex, the Madrid Codex. And you can see that Mendes basically took the same shape and the same designs, and he put it into his wonderful work called The Serpent. And then it's being recycled to this day. People are still using the TGP's images. So this is the 12th of October of 1992, which is the 500 years of the landing of Columbus. And now we're starting to call it Indigenous Peoples Day because it's no longer considered that Columbus discovered America. It's like it was already here. Mm-hmm. And this is a wonderful image. A student of mine collected it in Mexico City and then gave it to me. And it says, 500 years after the invasion, we continue to resist because, and down at the bottom it says, they tore off our fruits, they cut our branches, they burned our trunks, but they couldn't kill our roots. And this is very interesting because it's from the Popol Vuh, which is a pre-Columbian text. So we have this really wonderful image. They colored it in, they did this, but they didn't put Mendes' name on it. This was in 1992, some group of people who were selling these in the Zocalo in Mexico City. This is also recycled in the again, Viva el Israelén, and the same text at the bottom. I'm sure it's the same group of people, also anonymously using Mendes' image. And then Mendes and his compatriots started to produce sort of more cinematic work in this time period. This is a work that is remarkably early for 1949. And it's about television. Television was hardly known in 1949, but Mendes is almost like almost McLuhan-esque in his analysis of what television is about. Here it says, calaveras televisiosas, which is a made-up word. It's like depraved by television. And it's everything for a little hole. And then at the bottom, there should be a little saying, it's cut off here, it says, so what if there aren't any tortillas? We have television. And it's all about poverty and wealth and the media and advertising. Here the wealthy, the haves, the 1%, and here are the urban poor. And in a brilliant move, Posada made this skeleton woman and her baby look as though they were starving to death, which is quite an accomplishment. And this would be produced for the calaveras that they did for the Day of the Dead, which they issued every October in various ways. This has Mendes's print up at the top and a work by Mariana and Polsky at the bottom, and you can see that they're very collaborative here. Here's more of the calaveras. This is in the show, and here's a calavera that is also very cinematic. It's like a cowboy movie here. I'm going to show a little assortment of work by other members of the TGP. We've looked at a lot of Mendes. And this is Salce, who was no longer a member but came and went in the TGP. He moved to the city of Morelia. And this is about Mexico City becoming a big city. And he told the story of going out one morning and seeing somebody going through the garbage for food and talking to the dog. And the dog, he was saying, we can share, there's enough for both of us. It was a very touching moment for Salce, so it was the base of his image here. Also very surreal. Here's another work by Salce that kind of accompanies a work that I'll show you in a minute of Mendes. This is the Posada in his workshop, and it has Rivera, Orozco, and Mendes, and Dr. Otto, who was another well-known painter. And it's showing them as his acolytes or his devotees as they're looking over his shoulder. And he's producing his work and tossing it off to the other side. This is the left side of the print. And so little newsboys are running off with it. As you can see here, there are little newsboys who are reaching up to grab the pieces of paper. And this is directly taken from a posada, where the little newsboys take Day of the Dead calaveras and go off with them. And I'm going to skip over a few things because we're running out of time. Mendes incorporated Goya in a number of other ways, as other people did too. And here you can see in a couple of prints, 2 prints of executions or gun. In this case, it's an execution. This is also in the show from Rio Escondido. And it refers to the disasters of war with the bayonets coming in from the side. Another print by Goya is this other disasters of war, also with these guns coming from the side. And then you have the same phenomenon with this print that was for a miners' strike that Mendes did in 1950. Here are some works by some other people. Elizabeth Catlett, who is now very well known in the United States, but was started out as a guest artist of the TGP and then remained as a permanent artist and settled in Mexico. And this is Alberto Beltran. His work is in the show, and it's very beautiful. It's about the pre-Columbian and the oil industry. It's sort of like the combination of what's in the ground on one side is the buried colossal head of the Olmec civilization. What's coming out of the ground on the other side is the oil, which will make Mexico a rich and modern country. This is by Catlett and Beltran, and it's the focus that the TGP did in the 50s, which was anti-nuclear and peace work and education. And here's another work by Mariana Polsky and Arturo Garcia Bustos. Oops, sorry. And also you see the bayonets coming in from the side. There was this distinct reference back to the work of Goya. Again, a work about peace. This is Mariana Polsky's work about children cutting out doves from paper. It's called Children Working for Peace from 1951. And there were several prints by the TGP that referred directly to the atom bomb, and this is one of those. And then this is one of the latest ones. This is by 1961, which is very late for this phase, the sort of classic phase of the TGP, by Arturo Garcia Bustos. And this is a gigantic print that is about a Latin American conference that happened in Mexico City, also about the economy and peace. And the TGP more or less fell apart around 1959, 1960, and it continues in name as almost like a community center now, but the TGP as it was and as this exhibition shows no longer happened after that. The members went their separate ways, and they knew each other all their lives, but they did other things and they went to other places. One of the last ones I want to show you is this homage to Posada by Mendes. And here, this is the last of the three great prints, I think. And he did this in 1953, and he was very interested in making a mural of Posada, but he never was able to realize it. And here he's showing Posada in his workshop, and he's positioning Posada as a political revolutionary by showing him directly recording an event that's going on outside. And this is Ricardo Flores Magón, who was an anarchist thinker who influenced the Mexican Revolution. He died before the revolution, but his ideas influenced the Mexican Revolution. And he has a text that he's written that they're about to print with one of Posada's illustrations. So it's like what we see in the show with Posada and his ballads. And then the print that is being printed is a Posada. So this is the Posada that you see out the window. Like, there it is, right outside the window. And so he's kind of quoting this Posada print by positioning Posada as this active revolutionary. But again, he's talking about the state of the engaged artist as something of a melancholy, sort of contemplative state, that he can't really be out in the street, but he has to depict it. And in order to depict it, he has to think about it for a while. He can't just start to act. He has to contemplate as well. I'm going to leave you with this image here, and we can open it up to questions.